Okay, hello everybody. So glad that you're here. I'm gonna get started just because I do like to start relatively on time. I'm known for shoving as much content as possible into as short a time as possible. So don't want to lose any minutes. I see we have about 10 of you joining right now, and we are recording this so others can follow along. I'm really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, but maybe I'll give a brief introduction. Looking at the participant list, I don't know all of you. So I'm Professor Kwatinetz. I'm the director of the NYU Urban Lab, and I also teach real estate economics and market analysis, as well as urban economic development. These are pretty passionate topics for me. I've been involved in economic development for going on 20 years. And I've only recently joined the faculty of NYU SHAC. I love being at SHAC because we're all practitioners as well as academics. I think it's a really beautiful combination, especially when we start talking about real estate. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about an area of research and practice for myself, which is public developers, and in specific, economic development corporations. The Economic Development Corporation is not actually there's not a hard definition for that. It means something different in different states. So I'm going to constantly talk about public developers, which is not a legal form. It's a description of a type of organization that exists. And I'll describe to you kind of what that is, why we talk about it, what's important about it. I will say as context, the main project I'm going to be talking about here is the Austin Economic Development Corporation, which we recently created. I previously worked for the New York City Economic Development Corporation and have done consulting for the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, as well as starting an economic development entity in Augusta, Georgia, and helping to start something in Seattle, Washington. So this is an area of deep practice as well as research for me, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with all of you. So let's get started. This is called Thrive in Place. Thriving in place is an antonym for gentrification. Gentrification is when there is growth that occurs, economic growth that occurs that leaves people behind and causes a rise in property values that displaces businesses and individuals from equity in their surrounding neighborhood. Thriving in place is putting in place practices that allow to push that. Oh, my calendar is on screen. Well, you might need to know where I'm going. Let's see if I can fix that. Let's do that, and then do that. How's that? Are we better now? Doing good? Better. Okay, thanks, James. So thriving in place is when we actually create the opportunity for businesses and individuals to get equity where they live and work in order to combat gentrification. When we talk about economic development in the last 30 years, really post 1970s, started getting a bad name as just being about economic growth, which in the 70s, most of you can't remember, but if you do research, the 70s were a tough time. It's what is in the news a lot now about the fears of inflation and specifically stagflation, that as prices go up, wages won't keep pace with them and people won't be able to afford anything. So a lot of what was going on in the 70s is trying to prevent anemic growth. We were worried that the economy wouldn't be revived at all. That was a development of the economy. That was one particular thing. Prior to that, we actually spent a lot of time in economic development trying to make places affordable for people and trying to create a balance of issues that the market didn't help with. So we would develop the economy. We figure out how to develop the economy so it works for everybody. That was pre-1970s, and also thankfully it's now back in vogue when we talk about things like impact development and economic development. Really, we're talking about making an economy that works for everyone. We use inclusive growth to talk about this. It means you're trying to get a growth of the economy, but also make sure that that growth includes everybody. You can look at it in different ways. You can talk about people, whether those are citizens, entrepreneurs, or workforce. You could talk about places. being affordable, having good public amenities, having infrastructure and transportation. You could also talk about developing industries like we're doing with life sciences right now in New York and previously did with tech and video and film production. Or you could talk about capital, creating new capital structures like impact capital, ESG capital, working with the effects of globalization, pushing for localism, trying to get money not sucked out of a particular area. All of that's called inclusive growth. There are various economic development strategies. If you want to take my class on economic development, we'll go into this in particular, but I just want to give you the context that what we're talking about here is one strategy. When we drill in on public developers, we're talking about value capture. We're talking about using a large-scale real estate strategy to create inclusive growth outcomes. Why create an EDC or a public developer, I should say? Well, as cities grow to scale, the pace of deal making increases. In other words, more and more deals are coming in front of a city council or a county commission or a mayor. And the city finds it hard to move at the same speed as the private market. Why is that? Well, the city also needs to provide schools, police, fire protection, and doing real estate deals isn't necessarily its primary function. So this is true whether cities are strong mayors or council manager forms of government. If you don't know what that is, it's just that different cities in the United States vest executive power in different places. So it doesn't really matter where they vest executive power, they still have this issue. A public developer using land as a capital resource, it really began all the way back in the 18th century in New York when we wanted to develop the downtown around South Street Seaport and what is now the financial district. And there was no money in the government. It was very much a more libertarian form of government and less staffing and functions for government. So they worked with private companies and traded the use of docks for the construction of streets by private entities. It's a pretty cool program. In extremes of market cycles, such as the Great Recession, cities often rediscover the power of real estate when you're in a budget crisis, such as now. In 2017, when I worked at the EDC, we convened a group of 17 cities to ask what were the best practices in using real estate to combat gentrification, and that's where a lot of this initial research came from. Like I said, using land as a capital resource, Lindsay Galen has done some really great work on this. There's an essay called Land as Capital Resource. You can email me if you want to get that essay. Put my email in here in the chat. Oh, sorry, I didn't send that to everyone. So you can email me if you want that article. But basically, we had a lot of creation of urban renewal sites. When I say creation, this was actually a vast effort of displacement, mostly of African-American and low and moderate income homes, including very famously in Central Park. But when that happened, there was an idea that these sites were going to be used to make the cities better and more equitable. There was a good intention, but how it was implemented was not so good. And then in the 70s, after that clearing happened, all of a sudden there was no money actually to do a lot of those projects. There was also a hollowing out of cities as there was flight from the cities. For those who had the money to leave, they fled because they didn't want to be in a high crime or high tax situation, and that created a lot of unused land. Later in the 70s, the real estate market actually started rising, and there was an idea to harness the market, use the market. This is the rise of economics in the federal government. Use the market instead of funding public goods, instead of funding different agencies, just use the market to make it work. So like I said before, really began in the 18th century as a principle. In the 20s, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey were getting heavily into economic development and real estate development. In 1968, the New York Urban Development Corporation was found, what's now called ESD, Empire State Development. And then in 1970s, there was a big crisis and the funding was slashed. In 1980, federal funding was slashed again. And in 91, the EDC was created, although previously it was a public development corporation. And they suddenly had this big pile of land and no budget. And so they're trying to figure out how to use that to create money. How do you use land to create money? Well, whether you're public or private, there's really three ways to create non-commodity value in real estate. One is turning around a low value neighborhood. Usually that involves extreme gentrification if you don't put in protections. Number two is investing at the bottom of the cycle. No matter how many times we go through a real estate cycle, there's a huge swath of people that somehow believe the world is coming to an end and they've never seen a cycle before. So if you're brave enough and knowledgeable enough, you invest when all the properties are down. Many people did that a year ago. And same in the stock market. It's the only time I personally invest in the stock market. In a time like a year ago when everyone said, the world will never come back. I said, great, I'm investing. And really, you don't have to be too smart to invest at the bottom of the cycle. And then there's value add, using infrastructure and anchors to raise value above a commodity value. In general, we call that elasticity in the first case, counter-cyclicality in the second case, and positive locational externalities in the third case. This is really fun stuff. Again, I go into it deeper in class, but it gives you kind of a flavor of how to do that. In general, with economic development corporations, we're really working on all three of these, but the one that we can plan for is number three. 1 and 2 happen or don't happen, and you take advantage of them when you see them. 3 is something you can actually create to happen. The way you create it is using districts to create shared prosperity. We do that through 3 simple steps. One of them is defining a place and creating a boundary. The second one is adding some attraction inside that boundary that isn't the case outside the boundary. So you're creating a supply and demand dynamic. And then the third is having a mechanism to actually harvest the excess value that you get in order for it not just to spawn gentrification, but instead you capture the value and put it back in. A couple quick examples, then I'll get into the Austin specific. So Battery Park City was one of the first things using this in the New York City area. The World Trade Center used to be right on the coast there. There were a bunch of piers, but as they took out the World Trade Center, there was an incredible amount of fill, and they decided to create a new neighborhood where Battery Park City is now, filling in the area. For a while, they let it be a beach, and people had some cool chance to be on the beach in the financial district. And then later on, were able to finance and fund it through bonding against the future value that they were creating there. And as with many large projects, Battery Park City was said it would never ever work. And then the first couple of years, it was considered a huge failure. But note that it's still paying money, significant money, into affordable housing today in New York City. In fact, seeded an affordable housing acquisition fund for the New York City Economic Development Corporation just 5 years ago. This is for a project that started in the 80s. Been fantastically successful on the metrics it set for itself. So it achieved all of its goals and then some, contributing to affordable housing, creating a new neighborhood, developing infrastructure, helping to support the eventual Hudson River Park. And there's a little snapshot of Battery Park City today. Of course, this whole piece is fill. All of this is new land that was created in order to support that. How do you create land? You can also literally create bonuses where you have an existing zoning represented by this blue here. And in exchange for putting in some kind of new amenity like an art space, the city will grant a bonus that is changing the highest and best use for the developer in order to help them create this, in exchange for which they get a higher amount. Because you can't always just create landfill. You don't always necessarily have land there. But here you can create land in the air, which is very common, usually called an upzone or a bonus. Also, you can do a transfer. If you want to preserve something, say you have an existing building here in the gray, but the zoning would allow a developer to build up this amount if you knock down the existing building. But say the building is something you want, like a historic church, like Trinity Church, or a historic theater, like a Broadway theater. It's really hard as the neighborhood gets more and more valuable for the owner not to sell in order for a developer to build this building. So what we do instead is we create a mechanism for the owner just to sell this air to another building so that you can still preserve that existing building, but you can use the land, move it to create value. So those are a couple different ways. When we look at Hudson Yards, it follows all of these structures of the district wheel, creating this boundary, adding the number 7 extension to create extra value there, and then adding a platform over previously rail yards, and creating upzones and bonuses, all of the different factors that we just talked about to create the eventual Hudson Yards that we'll see here. Again, as with all these first projects, everyone says it'll never pay back. Look, in the first 2 years, it never paid back, just like they did with Battery Park City, just like they did with 42nd Street, just like they do with every large project. But usually it's just on a long time frame. Instead of a 2-year payback from a private developer, it's like a 10-year before it starts really paying back. That's why the government does it and not a private developer. If it were easy for it to immediately meet the needs of a private developer, the private developer would do it. We wouldn't need the government. But in these cases, you're seeing this line being the debt service, and then you slowly see how much money these projects, a lot of these projects return billions, cash on cash to the cities. Hudson Yards has all of these different aspects we talked about. So let me jump into Austin. In Austin, I've worked on and off for Austin since 2009. They originally brought me in to help them preserve cultural spaces and figure out how to keep some of the things that make Austin special there. Small businesses, music venues, cultural spaces, heritage spaces. And I had counseled them back in 2010, you better start an economic development corporation because you're about to get a huge wave of investment. Back in 2010, they thought they were at the top in Austin. And if you followed this at all, it's just kept going up and up and up and up and up. A couple years ago, they asked me to come back and help them actually start this EDC. We started investigating the feasibility of it back in 2014. Each of these bullet points is a resolution passed by the City Council of Austin. First, in 2014, directing the city manager, that's CM, to explore the feasibility of doing an EDC, then a big act for trying to preserve the music and creative ecosystem that I worked on back in 2016. And then in 2017, again, directing the city manager, please bring something forward. In 2018, specifically calling out the idea of a land trust to protect cultural spaces. And then in 2019, authorizing the creation of an EDC, which led to them hiring me back to assist them in that. In 2020, we went through a whole process that I'll briefly show you through that City Council asked us to do to authorize the creation of an economic development entity, identify potential funding sources, because a lot of these things are funded not just with general fund or tax dollars, they're entrepreneurial. They create their own money. How? Through using land as a capital resource. That's why I just went through that whole part at the beginning. Instead of just draining the government and creating more and more staff, the idea is create something entrepreneurial that is a public-private partnership, and that's what these things are. So they asked us to get stakeholder feedback on what to do, and then structure the entity that could manage a broad range of projects, including affordable housing, public-private partnerships, community benefits, a cultural trust, bring forward a recommendation. So what did they do? They hired a consultant, me, to come in and help them figure that out. From 2020 to 2021, we really spent time just meeting with people, understanding the current situation, benchmarking, meaning looking at case studies from elsewhere, creating an initial proposal, budget, and structure, convincing all the council to adopt it, and then eventually pushing the legislation through to create it in late 2020. This actually is an error. It's 19 to 20. That's a mistake. This is from October 2019 to about August 2020 when we passed that legislation. So what was the research and stakeholder engagement? Well, and again, this is an error. It should say December 2019 to January 2020. You know, COVID is almost a lost year. Certain parts, I just forgot that. We met with the City of Austin, elected officials, policy staffs. Each of these CMs is now council members across the mayor pro tem, the mayor, the City of Austin department staffs from different divisions, people from other governments and stakeholders and anchor institutions, DDAs, cultural districts, planners, Urban Land Institute, housing authorities, just to circle up and ask what was actually needed here to satisfy what the council wanted, which was stop gentrification, figure out how we can preserve the city that we want for people to thrive in place. Then we went through another set of meetings from February 2020 to April 2020. Again, apologies for those dates, where we once again went through all of these council members, all the City of Austin leadership, the city managers, the deputy mayors, all of the people as part of the redevelopment division, transportation, and then people that were involved in particular projects we had been tasked with looking at that I'll talk about in a second. One of them, a tax increment financing district, one of them, the cultural trust, and one of them supporting the local historic Black college and university, Houston-Tillotson University. The interviews, we asked about structure, governance, funding, powers, projects, examples from other cities. Again, we're asking everyone that might be a stakeholder or might be a voter in this issue that would allow us to be created or not. In general, people all agreed it was very important to have an entity that wasn't inside the city, but was somewhat accountable to the council, because they felt the city slows things down. They're not getting a lot of these deals done. We need to have something faster that moves with the pace of the market, but still have some control from council. They also looked at a blended funding model. So to do specific, no free money, but if the entity were going to do something that the city government would otherwise pay for, the government could pay the entity, the ADC, and also the entity could use real estate to create money through leases, management. It's really an entrepreneurial real estate developer, which is why, again, we call it a public developer. And then focus on maximizing the ability of the EDC to act as a public developer, directly transferring land from the city to it without a bidding process or an RFP, allowing it to manage and sell public real estate, leading and funding initiatives around inclusive growth, and expediting public approvals to make it more quick than when the city tried to do stuff. What's the purpose of all this? Again, it's the ability to retain families to stay in their homes and local businesses to stay in their place. As values increase, we want them to be able to stay. How do you do that? Well, you partner with the existing city and other government departments, agencies, quasi-public and nonprofits, and act as a real estate developer. Instead of pursuing profits, you're pursuing policy. You're helping to create affordable housing, affordable commercial space, childcare and early childhood education become one of the biggest things that families have to spend money on, especially to working parents. So if you can support that, you're making it more possible for them to live and afford housing. And then also looking at transit-oriented developments, they're all the rage, they're really great, they increase values, but what does that mean? They put pressure on businesses and individuals to be able to stay in place. Supporting efforts to end homelessness and supporting districts to become inclusive and not just promote growth. There's always a new idea for a district, an innovation district, a cultural district. But when you do that, you have to take into account those people that are there and not push them out. So the EDC should allow for increased community participation, outreach, and transparency. The case studies that we looked at, we did some national benchmarks across the country about different types of entities in New York and San Francisco, in LA, Philly, Miami, Chicago, Boston, and also Atlanta, which isn't on here. In general, these things weren't one entity. They were a family of different organizations that people referred to by one name. I'll show you what some of that is. But the three that wound up being great profiles were New York City, Philadelphia Industrial Development Corp, and Invest Atlanta. In each case, that's one name. But for example, in New York City, the EDC is actually 4 or 5 different entities. There's a cultural trust that's a part of the EDC, an industrial development authority that's part of the EDC, Build NYC is part of the EDC, but we just call it all the EDC. It's actually 4 or 5 different organizations. And it turns out to be the same thing in Philadelphia and the same thing in Atlanta. So that's what we did in Austin. In Philadelphia, you have a nonprofit that was founded by the city and the Chamber of Commerce in 1958 to spur growth. And then it slowly became also an industrial entity, a community capital or CDFI entity, and a regional center that allows for EB5. But it's all just called PIDC. But it's actually 3 or 4 entities rolled up in one. And also they act entrepreneurially as a developer with a big project, which is the Navy Yard. The New York City Economic Development Corporation, like I said, is 4 or 5 different entities. It's across the 5 boroughs. I previously was the head of asset management there. I managed the real estate and transportation and port portfolios. And it also, this entity has spawned off entities like Brooklyn Navy Yard, Brooklyn Bridge Corp, 42nd Street Development, Hudson Yards Development. Those all were incubated inside this entity and then kicked out, or partners with the Empire State Development and then collectively kicked out into their new entities. So this is an incubator, a real estate developer, a real estate manager at pretty big scale. 67 million square feet is the New York City EDC, which makes it the largest landlord of New York City held properties, which makes perfect sense. It's the city. And also it runs a port. So everything from starting the ferry system to running the container terminals and the cruise terminals. And also similarly has large scale real estate, proprietary real estate management, like the whole area of Sunset Park here shown. So how do we take all those examples and localize them? We're not in New York. We're not in Georgia. A lot of the rules are different per state. State constitutions have their own rules, but usually you could figure out how to do what you want to do. In our case, we went through all of the different rules of the state constitution in Texas and identified the different things that we actually were allowed to do, allocating certain tax forms, et cetera. So once we did that, we looked at benchmarking what are similar entities in Texas, how were they able to accomplish some of these same goals, which things did they have that the national ones did and didn't. And generally speaking, none of them were real estate focused in the same way. They had some of the same goals, but they didn't have the real estate powers. You see a lot of these things missing here. They're just doing one or the other. So we understood from doing all the research and the interviews that we still wanted to do this family of organizations, several entities like with the others. The reason for that is because the different laws governing financing versus real estate versus taking in money, but leave certain critical decisions with the city, and also focus the EDC on real estate, revenue bond, and contracts, and coordinate between different departments the projects that need to happen. So when we place Austin in here, the way we designed it, here's how it stacks up to those three other benchmarks. You'll see that mostly it's the same. When we get down to corporate attraction and retention and industry development, leave that to the economic development department. They're already doing it. They're doing a great job. Fastest growing city in the United States. We don't need to add to that. It's more about how we support the inclusive growth, the affordable housing, how we get money that isn't from taxes, and how we're governed. So we passed the legislation to start the EDC in August of 2020. And then we started with an interim board. That was technically the end of my contract with them. And then they renewed the contract and asked me to start up the entity for them. That last contract ended this past March as I put in place the March new board nominations. The board is listed on the right. They're representing all sorts of different entities, from homelessness to HBCU to urban development to job creation and childhood education. In June 10th, we did approve the agreement between the city and the new AEDC. And in July, we'll be passing through the South Central Waterfront, which is the big project equivalent to the Navy Yard in Philly, the Beltline in Atlanta, 42nd Street in New York. So these are the things that the AEDC is working on: the South Central Waterfront, developing a cultural trust, managing public pipeline. I'll go through a couple of these projects quickly, and then we'll go and see if you have any questions. How am I doing on time? Good, I'm doing good. So 10 more minutes and then we'll go to questions. So South Central Waterfront is basically an area just below. On the left here is the downtown of Austin, and on the right is the imagined South Central Waterfront. The South Central Waterfront is a whole new neighborhood. It's like the Hudson Yards of Austin. It's right in the downtown, but it traditionally was swampland and land that was used to farm cabbages. So all the zoning has protections for the land to flood for agriculture. There's no infrastructure, there's no roads, it's not possible to really develop very easily. The land ownership is very fragmented. So you see here, there's a lot of different parcels. There's 35 different parcels. Of those, there's very, very few that actually are city owned. So you can't just use the land and develop it. You need some way to create some interest for the folks. But why don't you just let them develop it as it is? Well, 2/3 of the developments here, including the largest site there, the Statesman site, they can't be developed without some kind of public investment. The infrastructure costs are so high of developing roads and drainage that it doesn't pencil. It's not like it doesn't hit a hurdle rate. It doesn't even make money. So there needs to be a big investment by the city. Almost 65% of sites require public action to enable development at all. And this is right in the heart of the city. So you really need to figure out how to do these things. And if you want them to have a certain benefits beyond just being developed, if you want affordable housing or parks or green infrastructure, you're going to need to find a stick and a carrot to figure out how to make that done. How do you normally do it? You create a tax increment financing zone. In Austin, that's called a TERS. It's also called a TIF, LIFT, DIF, DUFT, depending on what state you're in, they all have them. And what it does is basically freezes the tax base for the current year. It says whatever taxes are, right now we're freezing it, and whatever previously was paid in taxes, that's what will continue going to government. Any new taxes created will go into a special fund. That fund will be the TERS fund, and then that fund will be used, the future of that fund will be used to issue bonds, just like taking out a construction loan in a real estate development. Those bonds will be used to pay for improvements that then will cause the value to raise. So you're borrowing against a future project, but instead of being a private developer, you're the city. So instead of it being one building, it's a whole district. But in essence, you're saying, look, people, I can make all this land worth more. So I'm going to borrow against the future value, and I'll use the increment in tax base that comes from the future value to pay it back. What does that look like in graphics? Well, here you have time going across, and here you have property revenue from values going up. So if you just left the taxes where they were, this is the baseline value, this gray or light blue. Now, if you did nothing, the property values in most places will probably increase a little bit despite whatever you're doing. That's this rose color right here. That's what would happen regardless of what you did. The yellow is new value that you're creating by doing some investment up front. So in this case, we're adding things like roads and fixing the zoning and fixing the drainage. And that's going to allow people to build more than they would have built if you just left it the way it was. So then there's going to be more value and therefore more tax, the yellow. So a TIF says, give me money up front. I'll do something to make the yellow happen. And then over a certain period of time, the term of this TERS, which I'm using interchangeably with TIF, TERS is just the name of TIF in Austin. The term of this will pay back whatever investments were made up front. And then at the end of that, you release the TIF and the overall property tax base is higher, the green. So we put an investment in, we freeze the amount that goes to the general fund, the rest comes into a new fund that we use to pay down the debt that we borrowed at the beginning. There's examples of these all over the country. There's 3 Austin precedents, there's national precedents everywhere. In New York City, we do what we call synthetic TIF, where it goes into the general fund, but we track it as a payback. That's why there's so many newspaper articles that say the projects don't pay back, because we don't segregate it. But in general, they very much pay back and then some. So I'll talk about a couple of these Austin examples. We can find examples in every state. In Austin, they did a project called Miller that was on the old airport. The airport was moved to Austin Bergstrom. And then they had this big area that needed environmental cleanup, that needed infrastructure, that needed streets. They approved a TIF in 2004 for a $1.4 billion development, of which they put 50 to 212 million in. That's what needed to be paid back in the yellow. And what was created was 1.4 billion in new value. So it easily paid it back and then went into the general tax rolls. Waller Creek in Austin, approved in 2007. That was a little different. It was creating a series of parks and creeks through the downtown that would raise the surrounding real estate value. In this case, invested 128 million phase 1, 354 million phase 2, and generated 1.5 billion in new tax revenue. So again, easily paid back and then some, and then it went into the general fund. The South Central Waterfront, similar thing. We have inadequate lot layout, insufficient street layout. In each case, we have a challenge, then an investment that needs to be made to cause the yellow to occur, and then a larger development that happens that generates the yellow. So you have all 3 of those. In South Central Waterfront, there's an investment to upgrade streets, utilities, and open space, and the development is going to be almost 3 million square feet of office, 3,000 residential units, 350 square feet of retail. In order to make that happen, you need to invest some in streets. So in addition to streets, we also want to go beyond that, do new parks, plazas, open spaces, upgrade existing streets and streetscapes, do new utilities, overall 252 million. And then also we could reduce it by 75 million if we don't want to do all the public benefit side and just do the basic enabling. But the public benefits are pretty nice. We're creating a rain gardens in certain areas. These dark areas are creating new streets, creating a plaza to watch the bats go by, creating a creek trail to go through, a waterfront park and public space, and a square with a water feature. So we really want to fund all of that if we can. The baseline funding, we think in terms of sources and uses, here's the use of funding that we need, 252 million. In terms of the sources, private developers will contribute some amount. We have a capital bonding program, capital improvement funding, capital improvement program, sorry, CIP, that can contribute some. Utilities will pay for some to increase the amount of utilities that are there, but we have a gap of about 140 million. So the idea is, can we create a yellow that will fund that 140 million? That's what the TIF would do. So the AEDC can make that happen through negotiations, pursuing external sources, and also deciding things like how to do affordable housing, how much affordable housing occurs, what does it cost, etc. So I want to move forward. I'll talk about this last thing, the cultural trust. Another piece being recommended for the AEDC to do is to create a stabilization trust that creates purchases and long-term leases that allow affordable spaces that support artists and art organizations, preserves historic and iconic cultural buildings, and functions that in a way that provides for cultural assets to exist. So the city wanted us to support acquisition and preservation of cultural spaces. There's some really good examples as to why. You can look at the Red River District as part of Austin here. So Austin's, I love that video. It's just like one sample. Red River District is one of the places that really people think of, that and 6th Street, when they think about Austin and the music scene. And right now, all those places are being lost, similar to what happened in New York in Soho and for Off-Broadway and now in West Brooklyn. But the artists all came together and started rallying and protesting and asking for support from the city council. City council agreed to give support and put that into the Austin Economic Development Corp to start. Briefly, going back to that district wheel thing I showed at the beginning, one of the ways to do that is take a tax that's generated by all of these venues, so a hotel tax, because people are coming to see the music, and use that to fund back into iconic music venues, iconic restaurants, things that the city wants to see preserved. Cultural Trust is going to issue an RFP and start buying spaces and then making them affordable. It's quickly reaching that conclusion. It's for both small organizations and large ones that manage their own venue. Basically, it creates a capital stack where the organization puts in some equity. There's some city debt taken out and public equity that goes into it. We're also providing wraparound services, ticketing, legal services, administration, and now in the outreach phase of making sure everyone's involved. At the same time, we're analyzing the whole city for different public ownership, places where we might be able to take city-owned buildings or county-owned buildings or state-owned buildings and turn them into new cultural spaces that are permanently affordable. Permanently meaning forever. It's not, the landlord would be the AEDC. They would never be sold. It'd be just like a land trust. And then finally, of course, if we're doing the South Central Waterfront, we'll also look at cultural locations there, the equivalent of buying at wholesale versus retail when you're building a new district. So as we move forward, we're looking at all these venues. We're looking at public assets being managed. We're helping Houston Tillotson, which I can go into in questions if anyone has any, and just generally trying to define what inclusive growth looks like, what Thrive in Place looks like. People have talked about it for a long time. There's no government that I know of in the US that is focused on it as much as Austin has, and continue to work out there to seek how to accomplish that. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to you, participants, and see if you have any questions. You can put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature. I'm happy to talk longer, but I do like to hear from you what you're interested in. It doesn't, if it has to do with Austin or thriving in place, it is on topic, and you can ask. Any questions from anyone? It doesn't have to be directly related. Feel free if you want to just throw something out there. It could be anything about the state of the economy globally, down to some place you went to in Austin that you're wondering about, to trying to understand something that I put forward in the presentation. Really, dead silence. Should I try to call on one of my students that's here? Oh, Q&A, we got one. Good job, Jacob. Was there a lot of community backlash during these development projects in Austin? That's a great question. Backlash is a funny word. I think that in general, there's a certain percentage of people that don't want change, period, no matter what it is. And there's a certain percentage of people that want change, period, whatever it is. So you have to take that into context. I've never worked in any city or any community where there wasn't that going on. I learned from the mayor of Augusta, Dee Copenhaver, that what you really need to do is remember that both those categories will exist on the outskirts, but there's a center silent majority of 60 or 70% of people that you have to convince. Once you have them, they move to one side or the other, making a huge majority for what you're doing. So what I would say is that each project is different in Austin. There's that silent majority is thrilled that the city is finally trying to do something that involves inclusive growth and saving cultural facilities and trying to push forward the South Central Waterfront. However, at the margins, there are people who believe this is the wrong way to do it, or it shouldn't be 20% affordability, it should be 25% or 50% or 70%. So it's not to say that it's all yay or nay. There's been a very positive backlash of the city taking action to do something. There's a negative backlash about how long it takes to do anything when you work with the city. And then also there are fears. There are fears of a new entity coming in, and is it really going to help the people? It's nice that you say that stuff. Will you really do it? Are you going to be biased, et cetera? The only way to solve that stuff, you never get rid of that backlash. You just have to accept it's going to happen, and you hit it head on, and you have open conversations, transparent conversations, stakeholder conversations, and you have them again and again and again. I think in Austin over the last 2 years, we've probably done something like 200 or 300 stakeholder presentations, interviews, presentations, public, posting them, public minutes, et cetera. So it's a good question. Hopefully that answers it. What else? Anyone else have questions about this? You can say them in the Q&A. You can put it in the chat. You can shout it out. Oh no, you can't shout it out because you're not, we didn't make you panelists. But other thoughts? You're welcome, Jacob. I find this work pretty fascinating. I'll just stall while you think about your questions, if you have any. I find this work really fascinating. There's two movements going on simultaneously, one in the public sector and one in the private sector, to find this balance of what capitalism can look like when it works for more people. On the private sector, it's alternatively called ESG or impact investing. And I don't know if you've seen some of the recent reports, especially from the European Union on this. It hasn't been too successful yet in terms of narrowing in on actually having impact. There's more money going into it than ever before. But in terms of proving that they're doing positive stuff, there's very, very little evidence, and also a lot of counter evidence. I know I've been asked to join 10 impact funds, and in each case, I asked them what their impact strategy was, and it was, use the money that everyone wants to invest in impact. Don't you know how to do that? And they're still targeting their 20 whatever % returns. That it's just not reasonable to think that you're going to be able to get that all the time. So that's the impact side. I hope it evolves more. On the public side, it's really these public developers. The government started way back in the 70s to create these things. They've been experimenting with them, and we can say for absolute sure that they are having extreme positive impact. However, I don't think they're recognized. They're thrown into the same category as government, where they're actually this new thing. And consistently, they'd be able to create policies to attract people such as yourselves that might not work directly in government, but would work for an entrepreneurial entity. I think increasingly as we fund those, we're going to see more and more good impacts. Jess asks, hi Jess, for the commercial retail space, are there any industries the EDC is targeting specifically for South Central Waterfront? I would say right now, the predominance of the space in the South Central Waterfront is going to be office space. The retail is only about 350,000. So that probably means that it's going to be mostly what we call neighborhood retail, neighborhood serving retail. So it'll be grocery store, dry cleaning, drugstore, things like that, as well as food and beverage. And then we have this whole cultural trust overlay, wanting to preserve cultural spaces, iconic businesses, music spaces. So we'll try to fill a lot of the commercial space with that to push back. Justin asks, where do you see opportunity in New York for thriving in place? Everywhere. In fact, when I worked for New York City, that was my primary role, was trying to use land holdings everywhere to create more affordability for commercial and for housing. How do you do it? Well, New York City, you have very much a rising real estate values. So you need to put in place some kind of different value capture mechanisms, whether they're districts or land ownership or land banks, so that you could do cross subsidy. Cross subsidy is like 80-20 buildings or 75-25 buildings now, I guess, where you have some things that are affordable and some things that pay a lot of money, and you use the things that pay a lot of money to support the affordability. Now, I'm a big fan of old 421A, 75-25, 80-20 kind of buildings, but what I always say is, if it's 80% market rate and 20% affordable, we're never going to catch up to the 99% problem, where it's 99% of people that need affordable and only 1% that can pay the market. So I'd really love to see those. I really think New York City should move more to a 50-50 or better model of figuring out how to fund and make easy returns on 50% affordable buildings. I just don't think the 30% and the incremental is going to be enough. How do you do that? Well, in New York City, you have all these places where we're increasing value. And in particular, I'm really hoping that things that we put in place in Red Hook, in Sunset Park, and in Harlem right now, and in the Bronx, in the South Bronx specifically, there's a lot of areas where the EDC could be a force for good and not just growing property values. That shouldn't be the only metric of success. The other success is not displacing people and actually doing a count of the people who are there and understanding what their incomes are and putting in place at least as much affordability as existed before the intervention. Now, that was done with Essex Crossing, which is where the new Essex Market is, right on Delancey, and it's a really interesting project that was not done in Hudson Yards. So you can kind of take those projects and look at them next to each other. They're both EDC projects, but very different philosophies of how to do economic development, representing the different folks who were behind those original projects. But right now with well, we're almost past it now, but with that temporary retrenchment for market rate rental going down, I was one of the people advocating the city should jump in, counter-cyclical, buy up as much of it as they can, the hotels too, and turn it into permanently affordable housing, because you don't get those moments very often in New York. That's the first one in my lifetime. Anyone else? You can ask anything. I don't know what grade your professor is going to give you in the summer. But other than that, I can venture a guess on almost anything. We probably have time for one more. Nobody? Should I just wrap? Andy, you don't have a question? I'm shocked. Usually ask questions. Putting you on the spot. Zach? Okay. Well, hopefully I will see you all at some future event. I'm going to be doing another one of these faculty seminars in July, talking about historic Black colleges and universities. Thank you, Jess. I appreciate your comment. So I'll be talking about HBCUs. I'm going to bring in a couple experts from around the country to talk about that. And then on this public development issue, we're working on a paper with the Urban Lab about public developers and impact capital. So if you're interested in being a part of that, I generally accept applications to be part of the lab at the beginning of each semester. So just shoot me an email. I'll put my email in here again, and I hope I'll get to meet those of you I haven't, and those of you I have. Thanks for joining, and hope you found this interesting. Thanks so much.